For 14 years, a plastics manufacturing plant dumped molten plastic waste against the fence of a poor farmer named Elias Thorne. Not just plastic, molten plastic. Glowing, bubbling, hissing pools of industrial polymer that cooled into twisted, jagged mountains of synthetic stone. The heat alone killed every blade of grass within 20 feet. The fumes turned the air thick and chemical sweet, a smell that clung to clothes and skin and never truly washed off. The ground beneath the plastic became sterile, baked into something that resembled cooled lava more than soil. Birds stopped landing there. Insects stopped crawling there. Even the wind seemed to avoid that corner of the property, as if nature itself had drawn a line and said, "This place is dead." And every single day, the factory trucks rolled in at dawn. They backed up to the fence line, opened their hydraulic beds, and released another river of glowing orange and white liquid plastic that splashed and sizzled against the growing pile. The drivers never looked at Elias. They never spoke to him. They treated his land like it was an extension of their dumping ground, like the fence was just a suggestion rather than a border between two worlds. For 14 years, this happened. Rain or shine, summer heat or winter freeze. The plastic kept coming. The town had a name for Elias. They called him the Plastic Man. Not because he worked with plastic, because he lived with it, because he smelled like it, because his clothes, his hair, his very presence carried that faint chemical sweetness that made people wrinkle their noses and step back. Children crossed the street when they saw him coming. Mothers pulled their kids closer. At the general store, people let him go first, just to get him out of the building faster. The smell wasn't his fault, but that didn't matter. In a small town, association is everything. And Elias was associated with the worst smell, the worst sight, the worst failure anyone could imagine. His neighbors complained constantly. They called the county, the state, the EPA. They filed petitions and held meetings and wrote angry letters to the factory management. But the factory employed 300 people. It paid taxes. It donated to the local football team and sponsored the 4th of July fireworks. So the complaints went into files that gathered dust in offices where no one ever opened them. The factory manager once told a county official, off the record, that Elias's land was worthless anyway, that it was doing the town a favor by keeping the waste contained, that some people were just born to be dumping grounds. Elias heard that. Someone at the diner repeated it loud enough for him to hear. He was sitting alone in his usual corner booth, eating eggs and toast that tasted like plastic fumes because everything in his life tasted like plastic fumes by then. He heard the words, worthless, dumping ground, born to be. He set down his fork. He looked at his hands, rough and scarred and stained with 14 years of living next to something that should have killed him. And he made a decision that no one in that diner understood. Not then, not for many years to come. He stopped complaining. He stopped going to meetings. He stopped signing petitions. He stopped asking the factory to stop. Instead, he started walking the fence line every morning at 5 o'clock, before the trucks arrived, before the town woke up, before the world remembered that Elias Thorne existed. He walked with a notebook and a stick, and he poked at the cooling plastic. He touched it. He smelled it. He broke off pieces and carried them back to his barn, where he had set up a small workshop with a hot plate and a metal pot and a pair of thick leather gloves that had belonged to his father. His father had been a real farmer, corn and soybeans and a small herd of dairy cattle. The land had been fertile then, dark and rich and alive with worms and roots and the quiet industry of healthy soil. Elias had inherited the farm at 22, full of dreams about expanding, about modernizing, about proving that the old ways could meet the new world. Then the drought came. Then the bank called the loan. Then the factory bought the neighboring property, and built their plant. And the trucks started coming, and the plastic started flowing. And Elias watched his father's legacy turn into a dumping ground, one molten river at a time. His friends left first. They had been farm kids too. Boys who grew up riding tractors and shooting squirrels and dreaming about the day they would have their own land. But one by one, they sold out. They moved to the city. They got jobs at the factory, ironically, making the very plastic that was destroying Elias's life. They stopped returning his calls. At the high school reunion, they sat at a different table and talked about their new trucks and their suburban houses, and pretended not to see him sitting alone with a plastic smell clinging to his thrift store suit. His girlfriend left next, Sarah. They had planned to marry. She had loved the farm, loved the idea of building something together. But she couldn't love the plastic. She couldn't love waking up to chemical fumes. She couldn't love a man who came to bed smelling like industrial waste and woke up before dawn to poke at garbage with a stick. She left a note on the kitchen table. I can't watch you disappear into that pile. I can't watch you become the thing they call you. She moved to the city too. She married one of Elias's former friends, a man who now supervised the very shift that dumped plastic on Elias's fence. The irony was not lost on Elias. He read her note 100 times. Then he folded it into his notebook and kept walking the fence line. Year 1 was observation. Elias didn't try to change anything. He just watched. He learned the plastic's behavior. He discovered that different colors cooled at different rates, that the white plastic became brittle and cracked, that the blue plastic stayed flexible longer, that the black plastic, which came from the factory's night shift, contained some additive that made it gummy and resistant to breaking. He wrote everything down. Pages and pages of notes about temperature and texture and melting points. His handwriting grew cramped and tiny. Filling notebooks that he stacked on shelves in the barn, the town thought he had lost his mind. They whispered about him at the diner, at church, at the gas station. Poor Elias. Lost his girl, lost his friends, lost his mind, poking at garbage like it's treasure. Someone should check on him. Someone should do something. But no one did, because Elias wasn't hurting anyone. He wasn't causing trouble. He was just quietly, methodically, obsessively studying the thing that everyone else wanted to ignore. Year 2 was experimentation. Elias bought a used kiln from a pottery studio going out of business. He hauled it to the barn in his father's old pickup truck, the one with 300,000 miles and a transmission that groaned in every gear. He set up the kiln next to his hot plate. He started melting small pieces of plastic, controlling the temperature, timing the cooling process. He learned that the white plastic, when heated to exactly 412 degrees and cooled slowly, became something like ceramic. Hard, smooth, almost beautiful. He made a bowl. It was lumpy and uneven, and the chemical smell made his eyes water while he worked. But it held water. It didn't leak. It was, in its ugly way, functional. He made more bowls. He made plates. He made crude cups and vases and ashtrays that he gave to the few people who still spoke to him. The old woman at the post office. The mechanic who kept his truck running on prayers and duct tape. The librarian who let him use the computer to research polymer chemistry. Even though the other patrons complained about the plastic smell he carried with him. They accepted his gifts politely and put them in drawers and closets where no one would see them. But Elias didn't care. He wasn't making art for them. He was making data for himself. Year 3 brought the first real breakthrough. Elias had been reading about pyrolysis, the process of breaking down organic materials with heat in the absence of oxygen. He built a crude pyrolysis chamber in the barn using an old steel drum, some pipe fittings, and a welding torch he had taught himself to use by watching YouTube videos on the library computer. He sealed plastic inside the drum. He heated it. He collected the gases that escaped through his pipe system. And he discovered something that made him sit down hard on the barn floor and stare at the wall for an hour. The gases could be condensed into a liquid. A thick, dark, oily liquid that smelled nothing like plastic. It smelled like fuel, like something that could burn. Like Elias took a small amount outside, poured it into a metal can, and touched a match to it. It caught fire immediately. Blue and orange flames that burned hot and clean, without the black smoke of burning plastic, without the chemical stench. Just fire, pure and simple and useful. He had turned plastic into fuel, not efficiently, not safely, not in any way that a chemist would approve of, but he had done it, in a barn, with scrap metal and a welding torch and 14 years of desperation driving him forward. He sat by that fire until it burned out. Then he went inside and wrote in his notebook until his hand cramped and the sun came up and the factory trucks rolled in for another day of dumping. Year 4 was about scale. Elias built a larger pyrolysis unit. He collected plastic from the fence line, sorting it by type, by color, by the additives he had learned to identify through careful observation. He refined his process. He learned to control the temperature more precisely. He started producing fuel in quantities that mattered. 5 gallons a week, then 10, then 20. He used it to heat his house that winter. The first winter in years that he didn't shiver under thin blankets because he couldn't afford propane. The fuel worked. It kept him warm. It kept him alive. The town noticed. Not because they cared about Elias, but because they noticed the smoke. Or rather, the lack of it. The plastic pile wasn't smoking anymore. The chemical smell was slightly less. Someone drove past the farm and saw Elias carrying buckets of dark liquid into his house. They reported him to the sheriff, convinced he was running a meth lab. The sheriff came out, looked at the pyrolysis setup, looked at Elias's notebooks, looked at the plastic mountain that had been growing for years. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but he didn't see drugs. He didn't see anything illegal. He told Elias to be careful and left, shaking his head. Year 5 brought the first outsider. A man named David Chen drove up the dirt road in a rental car with university plates. He was a materials science professor from a state college 200 miles away. He had heard about Elias from a former student who grew up in the town and mentioned the crazy plastic man at a department party. David was researching sustainable waste management. He was looking for case studies. He was not expecting to find a self-taught polymer chemist living in a barn with a pyrolysis unit made of scrap metal. Elias was suspicious at first. He had been mocked enough. He had been studied and pitied and whispered about. He didn't need another academic treating him like a curiosity. But David didn't mock him. David asked questions. He looked at the notebooks. He examined the fuel. He ran tests with portable equipment he had brought in his trunk. And he told Elias something that changed everything. The fuel Elias was making wasn't just usable, it was high quality. The pyrolysis process he had developed through years of trial and error was actually more efficient than some industrial methods. The specific combination of plastics from this particular factory, with their particular additives and colorants, was producing a fuel with an unusually high energy density. David didn't fully understand why, but he knew that Elias had stumbled onto something valuable, something worth studying, something worth sharing. They worked together for 6 months. David brought students. They brought equipment. They documented everything. They published a paper in a minor materials science journal with Elias as co-author, a fact that made him cry when he held the printed journal in his plastic-stained hands. The paper got attention. Not mainstream attention, not viral attention, but the right attention. Engineers read it. Waste management companies read it. A few venture capitalists read it. Year 6 brought the first investor, a woman named Margaret Holt who ran a small fund focused on circular economy startups. She drove to the farm in a Tesla that looked absurd on the dirt road. She walked the fence line. She touched the plastic mountain. She smelled the air. Then she sat in Elias's kitchen at the table where Sarah had left her note years ago, and she made an offer. She would fund a proper research facility. She would hire real chemists and engineers. She would help Elias scale his process from barn experiment to industrial reality. In exchange, she wanted 40% of whatever they built. Elias said no. He didn't say no because the offer was unfair. He said no because he had spent 6 years learning to trust his own judgment. He had spent 6 years being told he was crazy, being abandoned by everyone who claimed to care about him, being treated like a dumping ground by the world. He wasn't going to hand over his life's work to someone who saw him as a business opportunity. He told Margaret that he would accept her money, her expertise, her connections, but he would keep control. He would keep 51%. He would keep the farm. He would keep the process he had developed in his father's barn with his father's gloves and his own stubborn refusal to give up, Margaret argued. She used words like scalability and exit strategy and market penetration. Elias listened politely. Then he opened his notebook, the one with Sarah's note still folded inside, and he showed her the entry from year 2, the day he made his first bowl, the day he proved that the thing everyone called garbage could become something useful. He told her that this wasn't about money for him. It never had been. It was about proving that the world was wrong, that he wasn't worthless, that his land wasn't worthless, that the thing they dumped on him wasn't worthless, and he couldn't do that if he gave away control. Margaret stared at him for a long time. Then she smiled. A real smile, not the investor smile she had been wearing since she arrived. She said yes. She would take 49%. She would help him build. And she would learn something from him about patience that no business school had ever taught her. Year 7 was construction. They built a proper facility on the back 40 acres, far enough from the plastic mountain to be safe but close enough to access the raw material. Real engineers designed the pyrolysis units. Real chemists optimized the process. But Elias was in every meeting. He approved every design. He rejected ideas that violated the principles he had learned through years of hands-on experimentation. He insisted on using the specific temperature profiles he had developed. He insisted on the sorting system he had created. He insisted that the fuel they produced be tested against his original batches, the ones he had burned in his house on cold winter nights. The town watched this happen with a mixture of confusion and resentment. The same people who had called him crazy now saw construction crews and equipment deliveries and a Tesla in the driveway. They assumed Elias had sold out, that he had gotten lucky, that some rich person had taken pity on the plastic man and was throwing money at a hopeless project. They didn't understand that Elias was driving every decision. They didn't understand that the knowledge in his notebooks was worth more than Margaret's investment. They didn't understand because they had never bothered to understand him. They had only bothered to judge him. Year 8 brought the first commercial contract. A regional waste management company paid Elias to process 50 tons of mixed plastic waste from 3 counties. It was a pilot program, a test. If it worked, they would scale up. If it failed, they would walk away and Elias would be back to his barn and his notebooks and his solitary walks at dawn. He worked 18-hour days for 3 months. He slept in the facility. He ate meals standing up. He personally inspected every batch of fuel. When the final report came back from the independent testing lab, the fuel exceeded every quality standard. The energy density was higher than predicted. The emissions profile was cleaner than diesel. The production cost was 40% lower then conventional fuel refining. The contract became permanent. Then it doubled. Then it tripled. Other waste management companies called. Municipalities called. States with plastic waste problems called. Elias hired people from the town. He hired some of the same factory workers who had dumped plastic on his fence for years. He hired the mechanic who had kept his truck running. He hired the librarian who had let him use the computer. He paid them better than the factory. He gave them stock in the company. He told them, in his quiet way, that he remembered who had been kind to him when kindness was all he had. Year 9 brought the first patent. Elias's pyrolysis process, specifically adapted to the mixed polymer waste stream from industrial plastic manufacturing, was granted United States Patent 10,847,293. The patent attorney who filed it told Elias that the intellectual property was worth an estimated $12 million. Elias didn't care about the number. He cared about the document. He framed it and hung it in the facility lobby, next to a photograph of his father's barn, next to his first lumpy bowl, next to the notebook with Sarah's notes still folded inside. He wanted everyone who walked through those doors to understand where they had come from, to understand that genius doesn't always arrive in clean packages, that sometimes it smells like plastic fumes and wears thrift store clothes and gets called crazy by people who are too blind to see what is right in front of them. Year 10 brought Sarah back, not to reconcile. She was still married to Elias's former friend, still living in the city, still trying to pretend that she had made the right choice. She came because her husband had lost his job at the factory. The factory was struggling. Elias's company was processing so much plastic waste that the factory's dumping operation was no longer necessary. The factory had tried to compete, had tried to develop their own waste processing, but they didn't have Elias's knowledge. They didn't have his patents. They didn't have his 14 years of obsessive study. So they were downsizing, laying off workers, closing shifts. Sarah's husband was one of the laid-off workers. He was drinking too much. He was angry. He was talking about Elias at parties, about how the plastic man had stolen something from the factory, about how he had gotten lucky, about how the town should have stopped him when they had the chance. Sarah drove to the farm because she wanted to see for herself. She wanted to understand how the man she had left could have built something that her husband couldn't. Elias met her at the facility gate. He was wearing clean clothes for the first time in years. The plastic smell was gone, replaced by the faint odor of machine oil and success. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He didn't seem angry. He seemed, if anything, tired. He showed her around, the pyrolysis units, the fuel storage tanks, the research lab where chemists were developing new applications for the process, the greenhouse where they were experimenting with using the byproduct gases to grow vegetables in hydroponic systems. The whole operation. The empire. Sarah asked him why he had kept going when everyone told him to stop, why he had chosen the plastic instead of choosing her. Elias thought about the question for a long time. Then he took her to the barn, the original barn, his father's barn. He showed her the notebooks, all of them, years of cramped handwriting and careful observation. He showed her the first bowl, still sitting on a shelf, still holding water after all these years. He showed her the photograph of his father, standing in front of a healthy cornfield, before the drought, before the factory, before everything went wrong. He told her that he hadn't chosen the plastic over her. He had chosen himself over the world's opinion of him. He had chosen to believe that the thing everyone called garbage might have value if someone was willing to look hard enough. He had chosen to prove that his father's legacy wasn't worthless just because the bank said so. He had chosen to be the person who saw possibility where others saw only disposal, and he had paid for that choice. He had paid with her, He had paid with his friends. He had paid with 14 years of loneliness and mockery, and the kind of desperate hope that keeps a man walking a fence line at 5 in the morning while the world sleeps. He told her he didn't regret the choice, but he regretted the cost. He always would. Sarah left without saying much. She drove back to the city. She filed for divorce 6 months later. She never contacted Elias again. But she sent a letter to the local newspaper, an anonymous letter that described what she had seen at the farm. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of wrongdoing. It was just a description, a witness statement. The plastic man was not crazy. The plastic man had been right all along. And the town needed to know that year 11 brought expansion. Elias built a second facility in a neighboring state, then a third. He licensed his patent to companies in Europe and Asia. He spoke at conferences, always wearing his father's old boots, always starting his presentations by holding up that first lumpy bowl and telling the story of the barn and the notebooks and the fence line at dawn. Audiences didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't polished. He wasn't charismatic. He was just honest. He told them that innovation isn't about genius. It's about showing up. It's about poking at garbage with a stick for 14 years until you understand it better than anyone else in the world. Year 12 brought the environmental awards. The EPA, which had ignored the town's complaints for years, suddenly wanted to celebrate Elias as a pioneer of circular economy solutions. He accepted the awards because Margaret told him it was good for business. But he never forgot the years of ignored complaints. He never forgot the county official who had called his land worthless. He used the award ceremonies to talk about environmental justice, about how poor communities become dumping grounds because the powerful assume they won't fight back. He talked about the 14 years before anyone cared. He talked about the friends who left, and the girlfriend who left, and the town that laughed. He made the audiences uncomfortable. He made them think. He made them understand that sustainability isn't just about technology. It's about who gets to decide what has value. Year 13 brought the factory's closure. The plant that had dumped plastic on Elias's fence for 14 years couldn't compete in a world where waste had become valuable. They sold the property to a developer who wanted to build luxury homes. The town was divided. Some people were glad to see the factory go. Others blamed Elias for taking their jobs even though he had offered to hire every worker who wanted to learn his process. Most of the workers had refused. They had called him crazy for too long to admit that he had been right. Pride is a powerful thing. It can keep a man unemployed longer than hunger can force him to work. Elias bought the factory property, not to develop it, to leave it empty. He planted trees there, native species, oaks and maples and wildflowers that would grow for 100 years, and never know that the ground beneath them had once been covered in molten plastic. He hired the same landscaping company that had once refused to work on his farm because of the smell. They didn't refuse now. They worked carefully, respectfully, planting each tree like an apology. Year 14 brought the empire. Not just the business, though the business was worth hundreds of millions by then. Not just the patents, though they were licensed on 4 continents. Not just the facilities, though they employed thousands of people and processed millions of tons of plastic waste annually. The empire was something else. It was the network of small farms that Elias had helped convert to waste processing operations, using his technology, his training, his belief that rural communities could be part of the solution instead of just the dumping ground. It was the scholarship fund he had established for kids from his town who wanted to study materials science. It was the research foundation that funded investigations into other forms of waste that might contain hidden value. It was the lobby of the original facility where his father's photograph hung next to his first bowl, and his framed patent, and his notebooks, all of them preserved behind glass, so that everyone who walked through those doors could see the complete story. The empire was also the fence line, the original fence line. Elias still walked it every morning at 5 o'clock. The plastic mountain was gone, processed years ago into fuel and raw materials and new products. The ground had been remediated, treated with biological agents that broke down the remaining polymer chains, restored to something resembling soil. Grass grew there now, wildflowers. A family of rabbits had moved in. The air smelled like morning dew instead of chemical fumes. But Elias still walked. He still carried a notebook. He still looked for things that others missed, because the empire wasn't the end of the story. It was just proof that the story had been worth telling. The town threw a parade in year 14. They called it the Elias Thorne Day. The same people who had crossed the street to avoid him now lined the main street to cheer him. The same mothers who had pulled their children away now brought those children to shake his hand. The same diner where he had overheard the word worthless now named a sandwich after him. The Plastic Man Special. He didn't eat it. He had lost his taste for diner food somewhere in those 14 years. But he smiled when they told him about it. He shook hands. He posed for photographs. He let the mayor give a speech about perseverance and vision and the American dream. Then he went home, to the farm, to the barn, to the fence line at dawn. Because parades end, crowds go home. But the work of seeing value where others see waste never really stops. There is always another fence line, always another pile of something that the world has decided is garbage. Always another person walking alone at 5 in the morning with a notebook and a stick and a stubborn refusal to believe that anything is truly worthless if someone is willing to understand it. Elias Thorne is 63 now. He still lives on the farm. He still walks the fence line. He still carries a notebook, though the pages are mostly blank these days. Not because he has stopped seeing things, but because he has learned to see them so clearly that he no longer needs to write them down. The knowledge is in his hands now, in his nose, in the way he tilts his head when the wind carries a smell that others would ignore. He is training his successor, a young woman from the town who grew up hearing stories about the Plastic Man and decided that she wanted to learn how to see the world the way he sees it. She walks with him. She asks questions. She carries her own notebook. The empire runs itself now. Margaret manages the business. The board of directors makes the strategic decisions. The engineers and chemists and operators keep the facilities running. Elias doesn't need to be involved in the day-to-day anymore, but he is. Because the empire was never really about plastic. It was never really about fuel or patents or market share. It was about a man who decided that he would not be what the world called him, that he would not accept the label of worthless, that he would find value in the thing that was destroying him, or he would die trying. He didn't die. He built an empire. Not because he was special, not because he was genius, but because he was stubborn, because he was patient, because he showed up every day for 14 years and poked at garbage with a stick until he understood it better than anyone else on earth, because he believed against all evidence, against all logic, against the weight of an entire town's contempt, that the thing they dumped on his fence might be the very thing that would save him. And he was right. The factory is gone. The plastic is gone. The smell is gone. But the fence remains, a simple wooden fence, weathered gray, stretching along a property line that no longer matters because Elias owns both sides now. He keeps it maintained. He replaces boards when they rot. He paints the posts every few years, not because he needs to, but because the fence is part of the story. It is the boundary between the world that was and the world that is. between the man they called worthless and the man they call a visionary, between the dumping ground and the empire. Every morning at 5 o'clock, Elias Thorne walks that fence. He touches the wood. He smells the air. He listens to the rabbits in the grass. And he remembers. He remembers the molten plastic. He remembers the chemical fumes. He remembers the laughter and the crossed streets and the note on the kitchen table. He remembers the 14 years. He remembers because forgetting would be a kind of dishonesty. Because the empire only matters if you remember what it cost. Because the value of anything is measured not just by what it becomes, but by what it survived. The sun rises over the farm. The young woman with the notebook asks him a question about soil remediation. Elias answers in his quiet way, pointing at a patch of ground, explaining the biological processes that brought life back to dead earth. She writes it down. The rabbits watch from the grass. The fence stands silent, and somewhere in a city far away, a factory is dumping molten plastic against someone's fence. A poor farmer is waking up to chemical fumes. A town is laughing. A friend is leaving. A dream is dying, unless that farmer decides to walk the fence line, unless they decide to carry a notebook, unless they decide that the thing the world calls garbage might be the thing that saves them, unless they decide to be stubborn, to be patient, to show up every day for 14 years and poke at the impossible until it reveals its secrets. That is the empire, not the money, not the patents, not the facilities or the awards or the parades. The empire is the decision to see value where others see waste, to see possibility where others see disposal, to see yourself as worthy when the entire world has decided you are not. Elias Thorne made that decision. He made it every morning for 14 years. He made it when the plastic was molten and the air was toxic and the town was laughing. He made it when he was alone. He made it when he was afraid. He made it when every rational voice in his head told him to give up, to sell out, to move away, to become what they called him. He refused. And in that refusal, he built something that outlasted the factory, something that outlasted the plastic, something that outlasted the laughter and the contempt and the easy judgments of people who never bothered to understand what they were looking at. He built an empire. Not from sawdust, not from gold, not from luck or genius or privilege, from molten plastic, from 14 years of walking a fence line at dawn, from the stubborn, patient, unbreakable belief that nothing is worthless if someone is willing to see what it could become. The sun is fully up now. The farm is alive with morning. The young woman closes her notebook and looks at Elias with something like hope in her eyes. He smiles at her, a rare smile, the kind that only comes after 14 years of darkness. He points to a spot on the fence where a new board has been installed, fresh and clean and waiting to weather into gray. Start there, he tells her. Walk the fence, see what others miss, write it down, and come back tomorrow. She nods. She walks. The fence stretches into the distance, marking a boundary that no longer divides anything, connecting instead what was once separated by contempt and misunderstanding. Elias watches her go. Then he turns back toward the barn, toward the photograph of his father, toward the first bowl that still holds water after all these years. Tomorrow, he will walk again. The fence will be there. The notebook will be ready. And somewhere, in the quiet hours before dawn, another empire is waiting to be built from the things the world has decided to throw away. This is the story of Elias Thorne, the plastic man, the farmer who built an empire from molten plastic, the man who proved that the only thing more powerful than 14 years of dumping is 14 years of refusing to believe that you are what they dump on you. He is still walking. The fence is still standing, and the empire is still growing, not because the plastic was special, but because Elias was willing to see what no one else could see. And that is the only magic that ever mattered. The young woman returns at dusk. Her notebook is full. Her boots are dusty. Her eyes are bright with the particular light that comes from seeing something that others have missed. She shows Elias her observations. He reads them slowly, carefully, the way he has read everything for 14 years. He nods. He points to one entry, a note about the way the evening light catches the new fence board at a specific angle, creating a shadow that looks almost like a hand reaching toward the ground. He tells her that he noticed the same thing 3 years ago, on a different board, on a different evening. He tells her that he wrote it down, that he still has the entry, that he will show it to her tomorrow. She asks him why he keeps the old notebooks, why he doesn't just digitize everything, scan the pages, store them in the cloud like a modern person. Elias thinks about this for a long time. Then he takes her to the barn. He opens a cabinet that she has never noticed, hidden behind a workbench, behind tools and scraps and the accumulated debris of decades. Inside are the notebooks, all of them, hundreds of them, filled with handwriting that grows steadier and more confident as the years progress. Filled with observations that range from the chemical properties of polymer degradation to the way a particular rabbit sits on a particular patch of grass on a particular morning in May. He tells her that the notebooks are the empire, not the patent, not the facilities, not the money. The notebooks are the proof that the empire was built one observation at a time, one morning at a time, one stubborn refusal to give up at a time. He tells her that you cannot digitize stubbornness. You cannot scan patience. You cannot store determination in the cloud. The notebooks are physical. They are real. They smell like the barn and the plastic and the 14 years. They are the only evidence that matters. She understands, or she thinks she understands. She is young. She has not yet walked a fence line for 14 years. She has not yet been called crazy by an entire town. She has not yet lost everything and kept going anyway. But she will. Elias knows she will, because she asked the right question, because she noticed the shadow on the fence board, because she came back at dusk with a full notebook and dusty boots and bright eyes. That is how empires are built. Not in a day, not in a year, not in the dramatic moments that make good stories. Empires are built in the quiet hours before dawn, in the notebooks that no one reads, in the fence lines that no one walks, in the stubborn, patient, invisible work of people who believe that value exists, even when the world insists it does not. Elias closes the cabinet. He locks it with a key that hangs on a chain around his neck. He tells the young woman to go home, to sleep, to come back tomorrow at 5. She nods. She leaves. The barn is quiet. The photograph of his father watches from the wall. The first bowl holds water in the darkness. And Elias Thorne, the plastic man, the farmer who built an empire from molten plastic, sits at his workbench and opens a new notebook. Tomorrow, the trucks will not come. The factory is gone. The dumping has stopped. But there is always something to observe, always something to understand, always something that the world has decided is worthless, waiting for someone stubborn enough to prove otherwise. He picks up his pen. He writes the date. He listens to the silence of the farm, the deep quiet that comes from 14 years of transformation. And he begins, this is not the end. This is not even the middle. This is just another morning, another observation, another step in a journey that will continue long after Elias is gone. Carried forward by young women with dusty boots and bright eyes, by farmers who refuse to believe that their land is worthless, by anyone who has ever been called crazy for seeing something that others could not see. The empire is not a place. It is not a business. It is not a patent or a facility or a number on a balance sheet. The empire is the decision, made every morning, made in the dark, made alone, the decision to see value, to see possibility, to see yourself as worthy. That is the empire. and it belongs to anyone who is willing to build it. Elias Thorne built his from molten plastic, 14 years of it, dumped against his fence, mocked by his town, abandoned by everyone he loved. He built it anyway, and so can you.